So the next speaker is Asja Derviškadić, and while she's getting prepared, let me read her brief bio here. Asja received her PhD degree in electrical engineering from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne, EPFL, in 2019, and her BS and MS degrees, again in electrical engineering from University of Rome La Sapienza in Rome, Italy, in 2012 and 15. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Distributed Electrical Systems Lab of EPFL. Her research interests focus on synchronized sensing technologies for wide area situational awareness of electrical grids operating in non-stationary conditions, including the development of enhanced phasor measurement units. So Asja, please.
Thank you, Ali. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for attending this presentation on the design and experimental validation of a phasor measurement unit that is simultaneously compliant with P and M performance classes. I am presenting on behalf of my professor, Mario Paolone, and we are both from the Distributed Electrical Systems Laboratory of EPFL. The IEEE standard for phasor measurement units defines two classes of performance. P-class PMUs are meant for protection applications that require fast response time, and M-class for measurement applications that is more focused on accuracy. Now, the problem is that P-class PMUs are vulnerable to disturbances that are generated by harmonic and interharmonic tones that are nowadays largely characterizing electrical grids. So the main idea behind this work is to build a PMU that is simultaneously compliant with P and M performance classes. The benefit is twofold. So on the one hand, we would increase synchrophasor technology reliability. On the other hand, we would lower down the installation cost. Let me briefly recap the various steps that enable us to estimate synchrophasors. So typically, a PMU acquires a time domain signal that is then sampled with a specific sampling rate, and a window function is used in order to isolate a finite length portion of the signal under analysis and to provide UTC alignment. Now, the core element of any synchrophasor estimation algorithm that enables us to estimate the parameters of the fundamental tone of a signal, namely the frequency, the amplitude, and the phase angle. In case of DFT, so discrete Fourier transform-based approaches, this step involves the transformation from the time domain and the frequency domain. Now, we focus on DFT-based approaches in view of their reduced computational complexity and intrinsic determinism. Now, the problem is that once we process our acquired window samples using the DFT, we obtain these bins, so a spectrum composed of discrete DFT bins, but we also know the theoretical Fourier transform of the signal that is characterized by this continuous curve. So what we want to estimate is the exact location of this peak, so that then refers to the frequency, amplitude, and phase of the estimated synchrophasor, which is then reported. Now, besides being characterized by very good computational complexity, DFT suffers from traditional problems, and during this presentation, we will see how we solve them. So first problem is aliasing, which is solved by using sufficiently high sampling rates. Then the problem of incoherent sampling, namely when the observation interval used to perform the estimation contains a non-integer multiple of periods of the tone under analysis. And this leads to spectral leakage, namely that the positive and the negative images of the tone overlap in the frequency domain, which is solved by windowing, and spectral sampling, which is solved by interpolation. Another problem is the vulnerability to harmonic and interharmonic tones, which is solved by the proposed approach. And finally, the hypothesis that the signal under analysis is characterized by time invariant parameters, which is solved by using short observation intervals. Now, the core technique behind our Synchrophasor estimator is the interpolated DFT, so the e-IpDFT, that is meant to extract the parameters, frequency, amplitude, and phase of a sinusoidal waveform by interpolating the highest amplitude DFT bins. So the e-IpDFT problem lies in finding the exact location of the main spectrum tone, and this is achieved by interpolating these bins, once we know the analytic expression of the utilized window function. Then the parameters of the tone are derived as a function of this correction term delta. The e-IpDFT mitigates the effects of incoherent sampling by using special windowing functions that reduce spectral leakage, and of course, the effects of spectral sampling by interpolation. The method proposed in the bottom reference presents a technique that is called enhanced e-IpDFT that mitigates the effect of the spectral leakage that is produced by the negative image of the tone under analysis. The method starts by computing the DFT of the input signal that results in these DFT bins. We consider a single tone signal model. We compute the e-IpDFT over these obtained bins in order to estimate roughly the parameters of the tone under analysis. Now, these parameters are utilized to reconstruct in the frequency domain the negative image of the tone under analysis, which is subtracted from the original DFT bins, leading to a spectrum that contains mostly the contribution from the positive image. Now, e-IpDFT is again applied to such spectrum, leading to a refined estimation of the correction term delta. This procedure can be iterated a predefined number of times, leading to more and more accurate results as the number of iterations increases. However, this method is not resilient against interfering tones that are in general close to the main tone. So that is why we have formulated this iterative method where the signal model contains two tones, so a fundamental tone and an interfering tone that falls next to the fundamental tone, and both tones are unknown. Again, the method starts with the discrete Fourier transform that is applied to the observation interval. And then the technique enhanced e-IpDFT that I just explained is applied to such spectrum, leading to a rough estimation of the parameters of the fundamental tone. These parameters are utilized to reconstruct in the frequency domain the fundamental tone in terms of both positive and negative image. That is then subtracted from the original DFT bins, leading to a spectrum that now contains the interfering tone only. Enhanced e-IpDFT is again applied to such spectrum in order to estimate the parameters of the interfering tone. That is reconstructed in the frequency domain, and then we subtract these bins to the original DFT spectrum, leading to a spectrum that contains now the fundamental tone only. If we now apply the enhanced e-IpDFT to such spectrum, we will obtain refined parameter estimations. And also this procedure can be iterated a predefined number of times, leading to more and more accurate estimations of the fundamental tone as the number of iterations increases. This method has been fully integrated into a National Instruments Compact Trio controller that integrates a Xilinx Kintex 7 FPGA. So as you can see from this high-level design, the key features of a PMU, therefore signal acquisition, PMU time synchronization, and synchrophasor estimation run at the FPGA level that guarantees time determinism and enables also the parallelization of identical operations. Then in the real-time processor, the synchrophasors are refined and then encapsulated according to the protocol of the IEEE standard, and then sent to the network through the network adapter. The table resumes the final setting of the PMU, namely an observation interval of 3 cycles, which at 50 Hertz corresponds to 60 milliseconds. We use a sampling rate of 50 kilohertz, and the PMU reports synchrophasors every 20 milliseconds. The compensation routines are executed once or twice for the compensation of the negative image of the tone under analysis, and 28 times for the compensation of the interfering tone contribution. The FPGA receives a continuous stream of samples from each ADC channel, and then 2 operations are computed sequentially in order to estimate the synchrophasors. So first, the DFT, that is computed using a modulated sliding DFT technique, whose details are presented in the bottom reference, and then the actual iterative EPDFT. Then the synchrophasors are sent to the real-time processor. This sequence of actions accounts for approximately 25% of FPGA allocation and takes around 1 millisecond. Now here in this figure, you can see exactly this chain of operations. So we acquire samples from the ADC, we perform DFT, then we perform iterative EPDFT, and we send the synchrophasors to the real-time processor. Now for each channel, we occupy 25% of the FPGA resources. Therefore, we can replicate the same calculations twice and reach about 50% of the available FPGA space. This means that we can execute these 2 channels in parallel. So we first execute channels 1 and 3 in parallel, then channels 2 and 5 using the same FPGA resources, and finally channels 3 and 6. The final FPGA allocation for the proposed design is of 60%, and the time needed to estimate the 6 synchrophasors is of 3.4 milliseconds. It is worth mentioning that this long latency is needed only when an interfering tone is actually detected. Indeed, in case the compensating routine is not activated, the time to estimate the synchrophasors is of roughly 0.2 milliseconds. The performance of the developed PMU is assessed by means of a dedicated PMU calibrator that generates the reference waveforms and feeds them back to the PMU under test. The PMU calibrator also integrates a phasor data concentrator that not only collects the PMU data frames, but also measures the data frame arrival time, and therefore enables us to assess the latency performance of the developed PMU. So the PMU calibrator enabled us to assess the accuracy of the developed PMU under all the test conditions defined in the IEEE standard in terms of total vector error, frequency error, and rate of change of frequency error. You can see in the table all the results, but probably the most interesting ones are those regarding the out-of-band interference test, which has been specifically designed for M-class PMUs in order to test the capability of the PMU to reject superposed interharmonics, which are close to the main tone. Now, as you can see, compared to the limit imposed by the standard, the maximum total vector error is 2 orders of magnitude smaller than the limit, and the frequency error is 10 times smaller. Thanks to the PMU calibrator, we also assessed the PMU timing performance by measuring the PMU measurement reporting latency that is defined as the time difference between the instant a specific event happens in the power system and the time instant the same event is reported by the PMU. Now the graph shows the cumulative distribution function for a test run over 24 hours. The first 30 milliseconds account for the sampling, so represent the end of the sampling window. Then we have the contribution for the FPGA calculations, which is very deterministic, of exactly 3.4 milliseconds, as we saw a few slides back. And then we have the contribution from the real-time controller that is less deterministic, however, always guarantees to fulfill the IEEE standard for P-class PMUs that is of 40 milliseconds. So to conclude, in this paper, we have presented the design, the implementation, as well as the experimental validation of a PMU that is simultaneously compliant with P and M performance class of the IEEE standard. The Synchrophasor estimator is the iterative e-IpDFT that is specifically designed to detect and compensate the effects of interharmonic tones that fall close to the main tone. The PMU hardware is based on the National Instruments Compact Trio platform, and the final FPGA allocation is of roughly 60%. The PMU in particular fulfills the out-of-band interference test with a maximum total vector error of 0.1% and frequency error of 1.1 millihertz. We also assessed the PMU measurement reporting latency that was quantified in 36.5 milliseconds, therefore compliant with the IEEE standard. I would like to thank you for your attention and answer any questions if there are.
Okay, thanks, Asja, for a very nice presentation.
Thank you.
I don't think we have any posted questions yet, so just to give the audience a few minutes in case they are still considering. Let me maybe start by asking you about, I understand that you are pretty much bound by the ADC output. I mean, you start your processing at that point. So, and therefore the raw measurement sampling is something you assume. So I don't know what number you are using. First of all, that's my first question. What's the raw sampling rate coming out of ADC? And the second question is, if you have the means of changing it, you may not, but if you had, how would it affect your performance? Would it help if you can increase that sampling rate and so forth?
Yes, thank you for the question. So the sampling rate, yes, can be changed. With the adopted module, we can change it between 10 and 50 kilohertz. We selected 50 kilohertz because the higher the sampling rate, the better the discrete Fourier transform results. That's by definition, and also we avoid all the problems related to aliasing. But specifically regarding your question regarding the 30 milliseconds, those are needed in order to buffer all the samples, because we use a 60 millisecond observation window, and then we refer the timestamp of the synchrophasor in the center of the window. Therefore, we cannot go beyond that value. It's by construction a value that we have to live with.
Yes, I understand. Okay. One last question, you know, obviously, I mean, you have improved the performance significantly, but, you know, when it comes to the discussion on PMUs, there people are always looking for this killer application in terms of its most impact. Can you give us an example of where these huge improvements will make the most impact? Just one example, maybe?
Well, I would say in general, in all the applications in distribution networks, for instance, where there are big contributions of harmonic and interharmonic tones. So for instance, on our EPFL campus, we are able to estimate the synchrophasors, but there are always some interfering interharmonic tones that are disrupting the synchrophasor estimation. So I would say that all the applications that rely on PMUs that are close to some elements that create pollution, so harmonic and interharmonic pollution, it would be definitely good to have a PMU that is resilient against those tones. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. Yeah, thanks very much also for the presentation and for answering the questions. I think we don't have any other posted questions, so we'll just thank you and then move on to our next speaker.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you everyone for listening.